The United States is set to unveil a new proposal for a ceasefire and hostage release deal at a much-hyped summit in Doha, the capital of Qatar, on Thursday, marking what is being billed as a last-ditch effort to reach a so-called diplomatic agreement between Israel and Hamas. At the summit, U.S. President Joe Biden's administration is expected to exert significant pressure on, quote, all parties to immediately approve the proposed framework. In other words, Israel, a democratic country that goes out of its way to prevent civilian casualties on all sides, and Hamas, a jihadist death cult terror group that goes out of its way to maximize civilian casualties on all sides, are in the same cuddly group. So too are the two men leading Israel and Hamas, according to a Western psyche that has disastrously lost its moral compass. Both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar are billed as hardliners. Netanyahu was, of course, democratically elected and runs the #1 technological, medical, agricultural, scientific, defense, intelligence, and culture powerhouse in the Middle East. You can disagree with Netanyahu's politics, and I have on many occasions, but he is not a mega-terrorist who turned the Gaza Strip into a jihadist fortress at the expense of the millions of Palestinians living there, while routinely committing some of the worst crimes against humanity during the last few hundred years. These descriptions are reserved for Sinwar, an Islamist Arab neo-Nazi who exhibits zero regard for his own Palestinian people, even more than he hates Jews. But to the Americans, Egyptians, and Qataris in the proverbial room, Hamas and Sinwar are practically on the same playing field as Israel and Netanyahu. Indeed, last week, the White House issued a statement on behalf of the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S., saying, quote, as mediators, if necessary, we are prepared to present a final bridging proposal that resolves the remaining implementation issues in a manner that meets the expectations of all parties. Hamas said that it was boycotting the much-hyped summit in Doha and would speak with Egypt and Qatar afterward. On Wednesday, an Arab official speaking to the Times of Israel downplayed Hamas's refusal to attend Thursday's hostage talk summit in Doha. And the reason for this is painstakingly simple. Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S. are in effect representing Hamas at the summit. Meanwhile, Israel is represented by its lonesome self, even as the Americans describe themselves as Israel's quote-unquote greatest ally. Yeah, and the worldwide COVID pandemic was kick-started by a single person who randomly ate a bat somewhere in China. If only we could afford to be so naive. Netanyahu has played hardball in these negotiations during the last few months for precisely this reason and others, in rightful opposition to the fact that the U.S. has slowly but surely moved away from ironclad support for Israel, which the Biden administration incessantly proclaims. In practice, the Americans are doing what is best not for Israel, but for Hamas. More specifically, the Biden administration no longer supports Israel's goal to destroy Hamas in Gaza. Rather, they believe Israel should simply downgrade Hamas, which means Hamas would remain alive in Gaza, even if badly bruised. An enormous victory for the terror group and its fascist, genocidal, jihadist, human rights violating state sponsors, Qatar and Iran. To add insult to injury, the Biden administration's rationale for this change of heart is equally disturbing. They are attempting to hurry a hostage for ceasefire deal that would be detrimental to Israel. So Biden's Democrats, now led by his Vice President Kamala Harris, can parade around to American voters that they secured such a deal, regardless of how bad this deal is for one of America's greatest allies. Greatest, according to how much Israel provides to the United States for pennies on the dollar. Sinwar and his Qatari and Iranian backers know that this is the Biden administration's primary motivation, which emboldens Hamas to remain steadfast in the terrorist organization's delusional demands that are shared by Qatar and Iran, even as Qatar, quote-unquote, acts as a mediator. This week, Egyptian and Qatari mediators reportedly told Israeli officials that Sinwar, quote, wants a ceasefire deal that ends the war in Gaza, an Israeli source familiar with the matter told CNN. But nobody knows what Bibi wants, the unnamed source said, referring to Netanyahu by his nickname. This is ridiculous reporting because it does not provide any new information. Obviously, Sinwar wants a ceasefire deal that ends the war in Gaza. That is not news. He has wanted a ceasefire deal that ends the war in Gaza since October 8th, maybe even since October 7th, so that Hamas remains alive and kicking while getting away with the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. The question is not if Sinwar wants a ceasefire deal, but what his demands are for one. And anyone with a half-working brain knows that his stipulations are 100% diametrically opposed to what is beneficial both for Israel and Middle East stability. At the same time, we know exactly what Bibi wants. The Israeli Prime Minister has said multiple times that he wants a hostages for ceasefire deal, which does, first and foremost, not mandate Israel agrees to end this war ahead of time. Netanyahu also has other demands, and damn right he should have them. Do you really expect Israel's sitting prime minister to mortgage the country's future away by allowing Hamas to get off the hook for October 7th? Whichever Israelis have been leaking these statements to the foreign press are only strengthening Sinwar and Hamas's position at the negotiating table. Truth be told, Arabs have a keen sense for smelling even a hint of weakness and leveraging it to their benefit. And this is assuming that Israelis have been leaking these statements to the foreign press. For all we know, this Israeli source familiar could very well be a Palestinian, an Egyptian, a Qatari, or an American source that is fomenting a narrative to suit their own anti-Israel agendas. In journalism school many moons ago, I learned that the media is not a reliable source of truth, but a capitalistic behemoth, no different than the tobacco companies, which used to promote smoking as not unhealthy. What's more, the Egyptian government's #1 threat for the last few decades has been the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Cairo in 1928 and led to the creation of Hamas in 1988 in Gaza. Sinwar knows that the Muslim Brotherhood terrifies Egypt's leaders, and because he is a ruthless terrorist, he has no problem threatening Egypt with a Hamas-led Muslim Brotherhood uprising in Egypt should the Egyptians push Hamas too hard in the hostages for ceasefire negotiations. Then there is Qatar, which most of us already know has been supporting Hamas directly, just as they support ISIS. The Qataris have transferred more than $1.8 billion to Hamas over the years. Yet this week, the Qataris made a point to note that they have, quote, limited influence over Hamas in the hostages for ceasefire negotiations. And worst of all, the Biden administration likely buys this bogus, because the Qataris have been paying off Biden's Democrats dating back to Bill and Hillary Clinton in the 1990s, and perhaps even before. There was also the previous Democrat in the White House, Barack Obama, who during his time in office coddled and courted Qatar, while pressing for the Qatari government to remain a chief broker in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, despite the country's long-standing financial support for Hamas. Qatar also hosts the largest American military base in the Middle East, in large part because the Qataris agreed to invest $1 billion to help the Americans build it in 1996, a deal inked by then U.S. President Bill Clinton. The Saudis and Emiratis have since offered to move the American military base to their countries. But 2 years ago, President Biden mysteriously announced that Qatar would be designated a major non-NATO ally, a classification shared by a select few countries, including Israel. Hence, the U.S. is effectively doing the Arabs' bidding against their so-called Israeli allies in this Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war, which started with a surprise attack on October 7th that the Iranians helped Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad plan. The Qataris surely knew about ahead of time, and Hezbollah joined the fray exactly 1 day later. Those more naive in the crowd like to point out that the U.S. gives Israel tremendous military support. On the surface, this is true, and it was announced this week that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken approved weapons sales of more than $20 billion to Israel, including F-15 fighter jets, which are not expected to arrive for several years, and nearly 33,000 tank shells. In a notification to Congress, the U.S. State Department said that the sales will improve Israel's capability to meet current and future enemy threats. This is an outright lie, and the reality is more like this. The U.S. gives weapons to Israel, boasts about it to American Jews, about 90% of whom are Zionists, to garner their votes and political donations, and then manages the ways in which Israel can, and often cannot, use these weapons, not to help Israel meet current and future enemy threats, but to help U.S. politicians manipulate this smokescreen to their self-interested benefits, no matter how bad this inevitably shakes out for Israel. It is like giving your child a car and mandating that the car sits in the driveway 95% of the time, and the other 5% must be used to run errands for you. Little do people know that this American manipulation has been going on since the days of Blinken's distant predecessor, Henry Kissinger, who in the early 1970s threatened that Israel would not receive, quote, so much as a nail if then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir approved of a preemptive attack against the Arabs, who Israel's intelligence knew were planning another war against Israel. Unsurprisingly, the Arabs attacked the Jewish state in 1973 on the Jews' holiest day, Yom Kippur, which was considered the single greatest fuck-up in Israeli history, before October 7th, even though Kissinger tied Israel's hands ahead of time. And Meir was a leftist Israeli politician. So the idea is pure nonsense that today's left-wing U.S. leaders have an issue with Israel because Netanyahu's right-wing government. The harsh reality, which many Jewish Americans do not like to hear, is that the U.S. has almost always been a fake and fraudulent friend to Israel, the present day notwithstanding. Hence why, this week, the U.S. seemingly managed to convince both Iran and Hezbollah to delay their major attacks against Israel, in retaliation for Israeli assassinations of high-ranking Hezbollah and Hamas operatives, until after the much-hyped summit in Doha. Basically, the U.S. is trying to blackmail Israel into accepting an Israel-unfriendly hostages for ceasefire deal by spelling out to the Israelis, between the lines, that if they do not cower to the Americans' demands in this deal, Hezbollah and Iran will attack them. How do we know this to be true? Visiting Lebanon, U.S. Special Envoy to the region Amos Hochstein warned Wednesday that the clock is ticking for a hostage ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, which could also help end 10 months of cross-border exchanges between Israel and the Hezbollah terror group in Lebanon. He could have warned that Hezbollah better think twice, even 3 times, about launching a major attack against Israel, because it is one of the Americans' major allies in the region. Instead, he focused on an Israel-Hamas hostage ceasefire deal as being at the center of what could help end 10 months of cross-border exchanges that started when Hezbollah joined, just 24 hours later, the Iranian-planned and Hamas-led war on October 7th. The same way that the Biden administration could be warning Hamas, either directly or via Egypt and Qatar, that the terror group either agrees to what Israel desires, the return of the hostages, including 8 American citizens, and Hamas's surrender in Gaza, or the U.S. will allow Israel to do whatever it so pleases against Hamas and its supporters in Lebanon, Qatar, and Iran. Instead, the Biden administration, as well as governments in Canada, Europe, and elsewhere, have been acting like the genocidal jihadist terror groups Hamas and Hezbollah are legitimate, respected players at the table. This self-defeating approach only encourages more terrorism, both against Israel and other places in the West, such as the United States and Europe. One could make the argument that the Biden administration, as well as governments in Canada, Europe, and elsewhere, believe that Hamas actually represents a major portion of Palestinians, and thus, to engage with the Palestinians, you must engage with Hamas. Why, then, have the Biden administration and others been telling us for the last several months that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people? The reality is that Hamas does represent a good chunk of the Palestinian people, both those who live in the Palestinian territories and those who immigrated elsewhere. Everyone with a half-working brain in Israel knows this to be true, because it is true. Many Palestinians in Gaza are unhappy with Hamas's civil governance, but they overwhelmingly support the terror group's military operations against Israel and Jews because they have been brainwashed to think that the Jews stole their land and should be punished accordingly, even if that means beheading babies, burning whole families alive, gang raping girls and women, and kidnapping young children and the elderly, including a Holocaust survivor. But what bothers me the most is not that the Palestinians are absurdly brainwashed to despise Jews, both in Israel and elsewhere. After all, they would not be the first to hate us. What bothers me the most is that these Palestinians and their death cult, kleptocratic leaders, are profusely enabled by the Western world. Even as these leaders despise everything the West stands for, democracy, pluralism, human rights and liberties, live and let live, and so forth. If the Palestinians were just absurdly brainwashed, but no one in the West really picked up what they put down, the Palestinians would essentially be irrelevant and become quote-unquote extinct on their own. Or they would be compelled to moderate themselves and their anti-peace positions against Israel. You know their drill by now. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. But because the West profusely enables the Palestinians with unfettered, unaccountable financial aid in the billions of dollars every year, as well as overwhelming gullible support. When Palestinians attack Israel and then cry about it, when Israel rightfully responds, the Palestinians have zero incentive to change their backwards, abusive, miserably inadequate ways. Just like Hamas has zero incentive to change its delusional demands in these hostages for ceasefire negotiations. They know, perhaps more than anyone, that the West, led by the U.S., is ultimately on their side, if not in intention then in outcome, doing the literal and proverbial bargaining for them against the one country that knows how to successfully fight against death, cult Islamists and their Muslim followers, all of whom seek to enslave the Western world and obliterate it.